Still have some people coming in, but we've got a lot to get to today. So welcome to Leading in a Liminal Season. I'm Kelly Morrissey, the Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Education at Yale Divinity School, and we are so grateful that you've joined us today for what promises to be a rich and informative webinar with our very special guests, Susan Beaumont and Sarah Drummond. If this is your first time joining us, I would encourage you to visit the Center for Continuing Education website, which we will drop in the chat, to see our various programs and upcoming events. A few housekeeping notes for today. Please remain muted during the presentation. We will be breaking into small groups about 30 minutes into our time together. And then we just ask that you all remember to mute yourselves when you come back into the main meeting room. Sarah will be moderating a time of Q&A for us a bit later today. If you have any questions that you want Susan to address, please send them privately to Sarah Drummond in the chat. We're going to enable the live transcript feature. If you don't want to see the subtitles, just go to the bottom of your screen, click on More, and then you can select Hide Subtitles. And now I'm very honored to welcome Susan Beaumont. Susan is a consultant, coach, spiritual director, and author of When Moses Meets Aaron, Inside the Large Congregation, and How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. Susan's worked with hundreds of congregations and denominational groups in the US and in Canada, and she's known for her groundbreaking work in leadership dynamics of large congregations and for engaging groundbreaking work in best of business practice, filtered through the lens of careful theological reflection. Before starting her own practice, Susan Beaumont and Associates, Susan worked for 9 years as a senior consultant of the Alban Institute. She's also served on the faculty of 2 business schools, teaching graduate level courses in leadership, management, and organizational behavior, and has corporate experience in human resources management and organizational development. Susan currently teaches at Wesley Theological Seminary. We're also blessed to have Sarah Drummond, founding dean of Andover Newton at Yale, with us today. Sarah has served Andover Newton since 2005, beginning as director of field education and assistant professor of ministerial leadership. Her roles at the School have changed, but her focus has always centered on administrative leadership, its study, its teaching, and its execution. By the time she was called to become Andover Newton Seminary at YDS's founding dean, she was a tenured professor of ministerial leadership and served as dean of faculty since 2011 and played a central role in the school becoming embedded at Yale Divinity School. Sarah's written several books herself, including the most recent Dynamic Discernment, Reason, Emotion, and Power, and the recently published Sharing Leadership, A United Church of Christ Way of Being in Community. But enough from me. Without further ado, we're pleased to welcome the Reverend Susan Beaumont.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thanks to all of you who've taken time out of what I know are really hectic, busy schedules to spend time today talking about leadership in liminal seasons. I have to secretly admit that my favorite part of a whole webinar is the ability I have to scroll through the screens while Kelly's introducing to me so I can see all of your faces and to feel that sense of personal connection with all of you there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can dive right into our content and make the best use of the time that we have together today. I'd like to begin that time by sharing with you this brief jewel of a poem by Christine McDougall called Liminal. The space between, neither this nor that, ripe, potent, uncertain, shaky, a dawning, a dusking, the imminent threshold emerging, crossing to what? Slow down. The moment is calling you to pay exquisite attention. And really what we're going to be talking about today is the importance of paying exquisite attention in a season that feels like it wants you to do anything but that. In a season that feels like you are pressured to solve all kinds of problems, restore equilibrium, bring things back to a status quo, working with people that want you to have answers and to resolve their disorientation for them. when in fact, those are the absolute wrong things to do in a season like this. And so the call to learn to stand still and pay exquisite attention in the midst of our own anxiety is the essence really of what we'll be talking about today. And all of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about come from the book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in a Liminal Season. So obviously in this short period of time, we're just going to be highlighting a couple of these. So if you're intrigued by this and want to go deeper, I'm hoping that you will invest in the book as well. So in terms of how we're going to spend our time today in this webinar, these first 30 minutes, I'm going to be talking at you using PowerPoint slides, introducing some language so we're all on the same page and how we're thinking about this. Then you'll be moving into some small group experiences for about 20 minutes, and I'll give you the questions that you'll be talking about when we get to that moment. Coming out of the small group experience, I'm going to talk at you again for another 20 minutes about the leadership style for a season like this one called Leading with Presence. And then we're going to hold a good 15 minutes at the end for any of your questions. And you've already gotten instructions from Kelly on how to register those questions with Sarah Drummond in a direct message as they're occurring to you. You don't have to wait until we get to that moment. Go ahead and start sending those questions as you have them. So if we're going to talk about liminality, we need to have a shared common definition of what we mean by that word. Interestingly, when I first wrote this book and sent it off to a publisher, I had as the lead title, Leading in a Liminal Season. And the publisher immediately got back to me and said, we'd like this content, we'd like the book, but you can't call it that because nobody knows what that word means. And so we called it How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going and used the Leading in a Liminal Season subtitle. But I think now in this pandemic, a season we find ourselves in, more and more people are accustomed to this language of liminality. And when I use it, I'm talking about the quality of ambiguity, the disorientation that occurs for us when we're in these transitory spaces. When a person or a group of people finds themselves betwixt in between, neither here nor there, between something that has ended and a new thing that is not yet ready to begin. And so that quality and that space, the space is liminal, the quality is liminality. I love what Richard Rohr says about spaces like this one. He says, it's that space that human beings hate to occupy, where the biblical God is continually taking us. And indeed, if we think about this, our entire biblical heritage is one long story of liminality. From the creation accounts and Adam and Eve's journey out of the Garden of Eden, as they exit the garden, they enter this giant liminal space that represents the rest of their lives and the whole human experience, where we expect to live out our lives until we are once again united with Christ in our final days. Every one of our great biblical stories is a story of liminality. It is a story of a character who was one thing, who was taken into a disorienting space or time, transformed, and then became a new person more wholly grounded in God, in the divine. And we can find that in the character of Noah in the ark. We see it in Joseph in the pit and later in prison, in Jonah in the belly of the whale. And I could go on and on about the liminal stories all the way up into the New Testament, where we see Jesus coming out of the baptismal waters and being driven into the desert for a 40-day and 40-night liminal experience of his own. And Paul on the road to Damascus and his temporary season of blindness, which is a liminal reformation time. And so the question comes up for us, if we know from our own biblical history that God works with people in liminality, why is it that we are so resistant to it? Why is it that we behave as if our role and our job is to bring back the normal so that we don't have to live in this uncomfortable liminal space, when in fact, this is the space that God has created us to be in? So this word, liminal, comes from a Latin root, the word limen, literally meaning the threshold. So In Roman times, ancient Roman times, the limen was the threshold space between the outdoors and the indoors, where a physical rock was placed for someone to knock the dirt off of their feet, to leave the outdoors behind and enter that indoor space. In our more contemporary language, liminality was coined in the more modern era by Arnold van Gennep in the late 1800s, when he in the field of cultural anthropology began studying tribal cultures. And in his studies, he noted some very common themes across all tribes and in all different parts of the world. And that was that when an individual went through a transformation, or when the community went through a transformation, let's just take the example of a young boy becoming a man. And as a child, he would have lived with the women and the children of the tribe, and at some point in time would venture out into some kind of a quest experience to discover his adulthood and then return to the tribe as an adult with a different identity. And what Van Gennep noticed in his work is that this was not just a journey for the individual, that the entire tribal system went into this in-between space with the individual by unfreezing their customs, their traditions, and their power structures, so that when the new person came back as a different identity, they could fold into the tribe with greater ease because all of that had been suspended for a period of time to welcome them back in. Now, Victor Turner picked up on Van Gennep's work in the 1960s and began applying it to organizational life. And it's really some of Turner's work that really informs what we're talking about here today around liminality in organizational settings. And all of this work around liminality always comes back to these liminal seasons having a three-part structure. There is always the separation, the ending, the letting go, the grief of something that was beloved that no longer holds us. A liminal period, much like this trapeze artist here who's suspended in midair, having let go of one trapeze and not yet caught by the new. There is this exhilarating flying moment of being suspended in air that's also terrifying. What if I am not caught? What if there isn't something on the other side of this to catch on to hang on to? And so there's separation, the liminal in-between space, and then a reassimilation period. We can find liminality in all kinds of different contexts. So just as an example, most of you I know are in congregational ministry. When we take our youth and we send them away to a summer camp or on a youth mission trip, we're intentionally taking advantage of a liminal context. We're trying to create an environment in which the individual leaves behind their self-constructed ego identity, and they let go of that for a period of time to be reshaped and reformed, to adopt new normative behaviors, to work on character development. And that they're able to do that in that space because we unfreeze all of the constructs that they came out of, their friendship circles, their school system. This is an in-between space, the camp, the mission trip, the pilgrimage when we send people on those, and then we reassimilate them as transformed individuals. We also know that there are liminal seasons for most of us in the organizations we reside in. In congregations, the most frequent liminal season that we encounter is the season around a pastoral transition, where the congregation has to let go of one kind of leadership and prepare for the arrival of a new person. And that transition happens well before the exiting pastor actually walks out the door, particularly in the case of a retirement. People begin anticipating that moment will happen even before it's announced, just by looking at the age of their leader. And that congregation remains liminal for a good period of time, even after the new person begins, because everyone has not yet fully let go. They're not yet fully ready to assimilate to a new thing. And we have a lot of anecdotal evidence of pastors talking about it. Took me 3 years before they let me drive the ship in this place. The liminal season was a longer period of time than the simple pastoral transition. We also know that we have liminal eras and epochs. Phyllis Tickle wrote so beautifully about this in her book, The Great Emergence, where she identified that every 500 years or so, the church, the larger church, goes through a massive reorganization that she called the giant rummage sale. And we can see this throughout church history, that these eras and time periods in which there seems to be a lot of disintegration, of things falling apart, and a period of great ambiguity before a new era and a new time of thriving emerge. So my thesis in this work is that we are collectively living in one of these liminal eras, which is not likely to end anytime soon. And this requires something from us. It requires a non-traditional leadership stance, something other than what we have learned and executed prior to this very liminal experience we're having. And it invites a different body of leadership work from us. Now, as we dive into this topic of liminality in organizations, it's important also to recognize that every organization or institution has a liminal tolerance limit. In other words, there is a threshold beyond which an organization can tolerate no more liminality. So that as we experience these things, like we have a pandemic, we have a racial justice reckoning, we have a climate crisis, we have political polarization, and then suddenly somebody throws in a conversation about gender identity in the church and how we're going to recognize that in leadership. And that becomes the thing that pulls us apart by saying this institution can tolerate no more liminality, no more disorientation, and in the institution and its infrastructures actually begin to crumble and fall apart. Much like when you see this space shuttle image on your screen of a space shuttle re-entering the atmosphere, it's protected by these heat shield panels. But when the friction of re-entry becomes too great because the angle of re-entry is off or something was miscalculated, and the capsule begins to lose those panels, we know that a moment in time will come when that capsule will actually implode. And the same things can happen in institutional life. And many of you can point to instances of this in your own denominational structures and in your own congregational life, that many of us feel like we are at our liminal tolerance limit right now, that there just isn't much more that we can layer on and tolerate without the thing imploding. But this is also an invitation to remember that the implosion in and of itself doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? It can signal the reinvention of the next thing. And that's what we'll be talking about here. Now, when I talk about liminal season leadership, inevitably, someone will say to me, well, you're talking about change management. And we've been talking about this for decades. But no, I think this is something distinctly different. You see, in change management and in all the change management literature that we've got from the last couple of decades, it all assumes that we know where we're standing and we know how to describe where we want to get to. So we've got a point A and a point B that we can clearly articulate, and we can, as leaders, we can be visionary about what point B looks like and how we want to get there. So then the job of a leader is to take people through their resistance to move from point A to point B, to anticipate the barriers and overcome that. Liminal season leadership is a different beast because we don't even always know where we stand. We don't even know how to describe what point A is. Just think to the early days of the pandemic breakout. Remember back when we thought it was just going to last a couple of weeks, and we were telling people we'll be back in the sanctuary by Easter, and we were making re-entry plans even as we were closing things down and making bold announcements about when we were coming back, and then we would change those plans, and you'd clearly have a point A in mind in the morning, and by the afternoon realize that's not where we're standing. So we continue to be in this amorphous season where we can't even fully describe where we are, and we certainly can't describe with any clarity the vision of where we're going to. It's just not clear to us yet. And yet, as leaders, we need to take our people somewhere. We need to stand with them in the disorientation and give them their meaningful next steps to take. And that is a whole different body of leadership work that needs to be done there. One of my new favorite scripture passages is from the book of Ezra. Not a passage that we encounter much because it's not in our common lectionaries, but just as a reminder of what this period of time in history represents. In the book of Ezra, the people are standing at the laying of the foundation of their second temple when we get to chapter 3. So the first temple period is done. It's behind them. The temple was destroyed. The people lived in this period of not being attached to a temple to form their identity. And now they have laid a foundation for the new temple, and they have come together to celebrate that moment. And this is what the scripture says. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and the Levites and the family heads who had seen the former temple, they wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. And no one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. What I love about this verse, these verses, is that they so characterize this moment in time for us as leaders of what it feels like to stand in the middle of something that feels like pure chaos and to try to distinguish the voices that you're hearing and to try to figure out who to attend to. Because we have simultaneously the people who are screaming at us to go back to an old normal and other people who are urging us to move quickly onward to invent something that's new. And we are so confused by the noise. Just think about the mask debate. Pastor, if you don't make us wear masks, I'm leaving. Pastor, if you make us wear masks, I'm leaving, right? Which set of noise do you decide to pay attention to? And for so many of us, the disorientation around the anxiety of the season prevents us from doing anything really meaningful in a leadership capacity. Ed Catmull is the CEO of Pixar, and he wrote this beautiful book a couple of years ago called Creativity, Inc. Now, Catmull comes out of a secular context, obviously, and that's who he writes to. But when you read his stuff, he's clearly a deeply contemplative person, a deeply prayerful person. And this is what he has to say about creativity in an organization that is known for that, right? There is a sweet spot between the known and the unknown where originality happens. And the key is to be able to linger there without panicking. So many of us in the disorientation of liminality find ourselves like this individual on your screen, standing in front of something that feels like a giant black hole trying to suck us out of our very existence. And our natural impulse is to flee that space, to take ourselves and the people we feel like we're trying to shepherd or protect and to get them the heck out of there. But what Catmull is reminding us is this is in fact the exact place we need to stand in with our people so that we can feel the sparks of innovation and creativity as they begin to present themselves to us. Because these liminal seasons are filled with all kinds of opportunities as well as the threats. And I'm going to comment just briefly on each opportunity and threat before inviting you into your small group dialogue. So the first great opportunity in a liminal season is this quality of community called communitas. This is going back to that Arnold van Gennep work. And communitas is the word that he coined to talk about the quality of the community as it let go of its infrastructures and its power bases to welcome that transformed person back in. Communitas is that state of equalized power bases. It is that place where our commitment, our clinging to the old way of being and the everything that used to define us melts away, and we stand together as people just ready for a new thing, not clinging to power structures, not clinging to old systems. And the remarkable burst of creativity and innovation that happens when a community can get itself into that space is called communitas. Another opportunity for liminal seasons is that it's the perfect time for rediscovery of our core identity and purposes, to ask the foundational questions: who are we? Who do we serve? What do we stand for? And what is God calling us to do or become next? This is a rich season to revisit those questions, because those questions and our answers to them are also shifting right beneath us. We thought we understood who we were, but now we've gone into this digital environment, and there's people who have found us and joined us there that we don't even know at all. And we don't really know what that means, that they're now attached to us, or how to keep them meaningfully engaged. And as we regather in our communities, we don't even know how to talk about who has reassembled, who's still with us, who haven't we seen in a while. And is it because they're really no longer part of our community, or they just haven't physically re-emerged yet? So all kinds of richness here around identity and purpose. This is a marvelous time for communities of faith to shed what no longer fits, to re-examine those things that perhaps haven't been working for us for a while. That 8:30 a.m. worship service that so few people came to, and that took so many of our resources to put on, but a couple of beloved souls were devoted to it. So we just kept doing it and doing it and doing it, even though in our hearts we knew it probably had outlived its viability. And that 8:30 a.m. worship service went away in the pandemic. Let's not rush to bring it back without re-examining, what is that worship service for? What are we doing there? Do we still need it, or does it need to be transformed into something else? Liminal seasons are a marvelous time to deepen our capacity for group discernment. Here in the West, we have gotten really captured by the Roman rules of order that created things eventually that gave birth to things like Robert's Rules of Order as our way of being, that we use decision-making as our collective way for negotiating our way through seasons. This is a season to truly help leaders develop their capacity for discernment, how to pay attention to the movement of God in our midst, so that we can join our efforts with what God is already doing, as opposed to trying to convince God to join what we decided to do, but to suspend our own decision-making impulses at appropriate times to lean into and develop our discernment muscles. Now, there's a whole series of threats that go with the liminal season, the largest perhaps being the presence of anxiety. I don't know about you all, but I've certainly noticed in my practice and in my work that when people are anxious, they tend to behave pretty badly. And the leader is oftentimes just captured by trying to manage all the anxiety in the system, to the point where nothing else productive happens, right? The anxiety is distracting to us, and that's a potential threat when we allow ourselves to be consumed by that anxiety. One of the huge threats in a liminal season is the whole experience of denial, of the people who believe still don't believe we really need to change anything. We just need for the pandemic to end so we can get back in our buildings, and then we'll be what we were before. Powering through this as if nothing has really changed. And then as a result of that, missing the marvelous opportunity for reinvention. But there's also a flip side to denial. And it's those people who are simply wailing and bemoaning that all is lost, that there's nothing left of what was before, which is also not true for us. And they're not open and willing to explore the core part of who we've always been that will sustain us in this season and take us into the next chapter. Changing power dynamics are both an invitation and a threat in a liminal season. We have many trusted leaders who just took a huge step back during this pandemic season, either because they were tired and they needed to, or because there were so many demands in other parts of their life that they didn't have the opportunity to stay engaged with the church, or they didn't feel like they could master the technology or couldn't figure out how to negotiate being engaged online. And that has created space for some new voices to enter in. I know I've noticed in my own home church that a couple of weeks ago, we received in a whole new class of new people. And I noticed how remarkably different they were from the people who were joining pre-pandemic. There were a lot of different features about these people. Well, that's interesting. How many of those new people who are very different are going to step in and offer us their leadership. And in what ways is that going to be an opportunity for us to learn some new ways of being, but also in what ways is that a threat to us? Because sometimes the people who are moving in to claim power when others have vacated that, sometimes they are not healthy for us, or they are not well enough grounded in who we are and who we serve and what we think God is calling us to do, to lead well. Which brings me to the last of the threats I want to talk about, which is the threat of the emergence of a trickster. Now, I want to precursor this conversation to say, trickster is a term that's used in a lot of different contexts in very different ways. In Native American and African American folklore, the trickster figure is actually a very clever individual who outsmarts the systems of power and abuse and triumphs. Okay, that's not how I'm using the term. Okay, so for the moment, set that aside. This understanding of the trickster again comes from Arnold van Gennep's work on liminality, and that's why I cling to this term, because it's his. The trickster is an individual that's a dangerous figure because they're highly charismatic. And in a liminal season, they will often step into the center of an institution or an organization and claim power for themselves. But the problem is that tricksters are incapable of living well in community. Because of their charisma, everyone is inclined to give them a chance. They usually have a different way of looking at things, and they promise different kinds of outcomes or a return to something that feels more comfortable. But the reality is that the trickster, once they're in there, only fuels and feeds chaos, because they are not interested in the well-being of the larger community. They're only interested in their own place in it. And the problem for the organization then is to figure out what to do with the trickster once they've grabbed that power, and how to move them back to the sidelines or outside of the organization once they've got that power. Okay, I have been talking at you for a while now, and I'm going to want to give you some time to talk to each other. So Megan's going to be putting you into some small groups here in just a matter of moments, and she's also going to be putting these questions into the chat so that you have access to them once you get into your small groups. And this is what I want you to talk about. Let's not spend time introducing ourselves a lot to one another, because this is a very transitory kind of space in and of itself. Here's what I'd like you to be talking about in your small groups. Pandemic and racial justice reckoning have moved all of us together into liminal space. But I'd like you to think about what other factors there are that are specific to your local context that are adding to that experience of liminality. And I'd like you to talk also about, what do you notice that was possible before that's no longer possible now? You know, before you have this experience of profound liminality, what were you working on or trying to do that you've had to abandon or pursue in a different way now? And what new opportunities and emerging threats do you see facing you? What do you see coming out of this? What are you attending to in your environment? So that's the dialogue we're going to have. I'm going to stop share and turn you back over to Megan, who's going to invite you into those small groups. Make sure you respond on your screen so that you can get resorted. All right. Welcome back, friends. I think we're all back and assembled again. I want to go ahead, and I hope you had some rich conversations within your rooms. I'd like to go ahead and reshare my screen so that we can talk now about a parallel concept to liminality that I'd like to introduce. Up to this point in time, we've been talking about that state of ambiguity and disorientation, and what the qualities and characteristics of that are, and what that feels like, and what the challenges and the opportunities are. I'm going to switch your focus now. We're going to move over to talking about what it means to lead with presence. And when I use that phrase, I'm going to be referring to a fundamental leadership stance that's grounded in a more contemplative sense of wonder and an openness to the leading of the divine. It's got some of the same features of how we have traditionally led, but it comes from a fundamentally different kind of place. So that when I use this term leading with presence, what I'm talking about is a refusal to acknowledge a false dichotomy that I see out there a lot in congregations that we have created between leading the organizational side of the church and the spiritual side of, or the theological side of the church. So I oftentimes see pastors who approach their preaching, their teaching, their pastoral care out of one kind of headspace, and then they seem to turn that off, all of that, and they step into organizational leadership that's not very informed by all of what they do in the pulpit and in their teaching and in their pastoral care. So that leading with presence seeks to infuse good organizational leadership with contemplative leadership stance and practices. And this is built on the assumption that God cares about what we're doing in our institutional settings, beyond simply operating with strong moral character. Sometimes we operate as if we think God wants us to pursue justice and to be good people in the world, but that God doesn't really care what we're doing about day-to-day decision making around how we use our building and how we're structuring our operating budget and some of the more mundane parts of church life. Leading with presence trusts that the Holy Spirit will be a guide in our collective actions, but we have to yield control in order for that to happen. And that's one thing we're struggling with right now and maybe have for all of time. Leading with presence embraces the notion that there is a soulfulness in the institution itself, which will respond to your leadership. And I would go on to say that the most vibrant congregations I have encountered are ones in which the soul of the leader connects with the soul of the institution, that the institution has its own internal divine spark that knows what it is and what it's supposed to be, and that there's an authenticity there that we need to tap into. Leading with presence honors the interaction of those two things. Now, to get to a better conversation about what it means to lead with presence, we need to start with what are our traditional orientations to what it means to lead. And this graph or this chart that you see on your page is from Heifetz work in the practice of adaptive leadership. And what Heifetz points out to us that our traditional stances in leadership are stances in which the leader is expected and rewarded for providing direction, protection, and order. This is what we want our leaders to do on our behalf and what we expect from them. And those leaders who are able to do this, to do these things I have listed on the page, these are the people we promote into more responsible positions. And when the organization gets anxious, it turns to its leaders to do these three fundamental kinds of work. And it gets angry with leaders who refuse to do these things, oftentimes classifying them as inept for not being able to provide direction to us, to protect us from the external threats, and restore us to the order that we have become accustomed to. So these traditional leadership stances of providing direction and protection and order are heavily invested in three spiritual stances that I want to lift up here. The traditional way that we have approached leadership is invested in a stance with the leader as a knowing person, is the individual that has all the expertise and the answers, that knows us how to get us from point A to point B, and knows how to relate to us in that space. The traditional leadership stance is heavily invested in advocacy of the leader, identifying a pathway forward and advocating for what they understand to be the right way forward. So that sense of dogged persistence of the leader saying, we're going this way and I'm going to take you and we're going to keep pursuing it until we have fully arrived. And then the third of the spiritual stances that this traditional format is invested in is the stance of striving. And I'm seeing so much of this right now that is bringing people to the brink of exhaustion. This notion that we can work harder and harder and harder at the things that we know how to do and the things we've done in the past to bring us out of disorientation. Like, if we work hard enough, we can resolve this liminal experience that we're all having. We can force it to come to an end somehow, or force ourselves through it and protect our people by working harder in it. And so what I want to lift up here, when I talk about leading with presence, I'm talking about making three fundamental shifts in your spiritual stance that will then allow you to change your leadership stance. And as we talk about these shifts in spiritual stance, I want to introduce the language of the false self and the true self. This language first came to us from Thomas Merton in his work. Richard Rohr works with it a lot in his writing. And it's this notion that your false self is a self that has been created by you. It's not known by God because God has nothing to do with that false self. It is a construct of your ego. Your false self is the self that wants to look good, that wants to have a positive vocational career path, that wants others to admire you, that wants to be known for having led this church well in this season. All of those investments in how I'm appearing and how I'm being received and respected, all of that comes out of false self. True self is my deepest identity of who I have been created to be by God and in God. And it's free from those false constructs of ego. My true self is not particularly invested in whether or not I'm admired. It's not invested in how many people signed up for a webinar, or how many people paid me to do a thing, or how many followers that I have in social media, or whether I'm admired by denominational leaders. My true self knows this is what I'm gifted at doing. This is what I've been called to do. And I may or may not be liked by how I lead through this season, but I know what's called for in the moment, and I will stay with that because it's true to myself and true to who God is. So these three shifts that we need to do, let me go back here for just a second to this previous screen. These three shifts that we need to do together, moving from knowing to unknowing, advocacy and attending, from striving to surrender, are a move all the way out of that false self and into the true self. And I want to tell you a story from my own consulting practice that I think illustrates what I'm talking about here better than talking about it in the abstract. So several years ago, I was working with a congregation down in Texas on a strategic planning process. And this was going to be a year-long journey for this congregation. They were doing a deep dive into asking the fundamental questions: who are we? Who do we serve? What is God calling us to do or become next? And so we began with a period of self-study that took about 4 months. And we surveyed the congregation, we did listening groups, we did demographic studies, we interviewed community leaders, we did all those kinds of things to try to get a handle on what's happening in the community, what's happening in the changing dynamics of the congregation. And we were coming together for a weekend with the leaders of this congregation. And because it was a large congregation, we were expecting about 85 people in the room. And the purpose of this weekend gathering, this leadership retreat, which was going to happen on Friday night, all day Saturday, was for the planning team to teach this larger leadership group everything that they had learned through the self-study. And so we were getting ready for the event, and there was kind of a nervous but optimistic energy within the room. And I was in my own head kind of preparing for leading this weekend, which, by the way, I've led countless times in other settings. And what I know is I know how the weekend needs to flow. I mean, I have it outlined down to 5-minute increments of what needs to happen when. I know that if this weekend gets off track, what ends up happening is you hit the end of the weekend and you haven't hit the final part of the work. And the final part of the work is to name the new strategic priorities of the congregation. So if you don't get them to get all the way through the design of the weekend, they end up without clarity about their future, and then they all feel like they wasted time. The other thing I know is that I'm really good at large group facilitation. And so I have a certain level of confidence in my ability to do that. And that was the mindset I was in this late afternoon as we were preparing to begin this event. And into the room walks this character that I'm going to name Joel. Now, I had never met Joel before in any of the work we had done. He had been invited to the event. For some reason, he arrived a full hour early. And immediately when he arrived, he began undoing everything that had already been done. He was criticizing every aspect of the room that had already been set up. And it became clear to me pretty early on that there was something behaviorally off with Joel. I don't have the background to diagnose whatever his behavioral disorder was, but I knew that he wasn't demonstrating a capacity to participate well in the group experience, right? And so my facilitator antenna just popped up immediately as I began to realize I am going to need to control Joel through this weekend, or he is going to take us way off track. And so I got real intentional about giving him small things to do, moving him around the room as the event began so he couldn't be overly disruptive at one table or another. We got through Friday night pretty well. We got through the opening of Saturday morning, and I was feeling pretty good about things. We were on track. There was good energy in the room. Joel was more or less behaving, not acting out too badly. When we hit late Saturday morning, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Joel get up from his table and come across to me, and he got in my face and he said, "We need to stop and pray now." I said, "Joel, look at the room. Everybody, all the small tables were engaged, really industrious in the work I had given them to do. The energy was great." I said, "No, we're not doing that right now, because we're gonna be praying as soon as the small group experience is over. I need you to go back to your table and sit down and not disrupt what we've already got going on." And Joel planted himself in my face, and he got louder, and he said, "No, we need to stop and pray now." And again, I came back and said, "We're not going to do that." Explain why. Well, this was escalating pretty quickly, so that people were starting to turn and notice that Joel and I were having words at the beginning, at the front of the classroom. And finally, it occurred to me, I just have to yield to this, because I don't know how else to handle him in the moment. And this is going to take us 10 minutes off track, but I'll make it up somewhere else, is what I'm thinking in my head. So I get the pastor comes up, leads a beautiful prayer. I invite the people to work at their tables in prayer for a while before we come back. And the whole time that the prayer is happening in my mind, I'm calculating, where do I make up the time? How do I work through this? How do I get us back on track? How do I work harder to make this work better? And then something shifted for me in my own internal dialogue when I began to notice that there was a shifting in the room, that something was happening. There was a quality that was different in the air of the room, and that people had settled into a different way of being. And to this day, I cannot explain fully what happened there. But what I know is that for weeks after this event, leaders who participated commented on how all the best ideas about the future of the church emerged in the moments following that prayer moment, right? That something bubbled up there in the room that they interacted with, that allowed them to engage the work in a reinvigorated kind of way. And I had to come to acknowledge that I had to make this shift. I was in this false self. I was in this self that had all the answers, had all the expertise, was advocating for my process, was working harder to make sure it happened. And it took Joel and his insight and his wisdom to pull me out of that place of knowing, even that judgmental pigeonholing I had done about him. He pulled me out of that into this place of unknowing and attending and surrender, so that collectively we could experience divine something happening in that place and in that room. And for me, that today still stands as just a classic example of making the shift, of letting go so that something new might come. Letting go so that something new might come. That's Otto Scharmer's language. And to this day, I have to be thankful for Joel for knowing. People, so many people ask me after that, how did you know to stop in that moment? How did you know to attend to that? I didn't. I wasn't attentive to it at all, but I continue to be really grateful to Joel for his ability to sense something in the room and to take us into that place. So let's just talk briefly about these 3 spiritual shifts. And then we'll kind of open up into some general Q&A. The first shift from knowing to unknowing. Now, I'm not asking you to suddenly get stupid. I'm not asking you to suddenly stop learning new things. Learning new things is always important. The spiritual shift I'm talking about is one in which we become deeply suspicious of our own knowing. We hold our knowledge and what feels like wisdom to us here, and we recognize that probably it is not going to be sufficient to the moment. That what I know right here, right now in this space is not enough to help this local church reinvent itself for its new chapter. That expertise is going to have to come from someplace else. And I'm going to have to be willing to share the knowledge I have, but to let it go when it's clear that my knowing is insufficient to the moment. That's the shift from knowing to unknowing. Then I'm also going to have to shift out of that advocacy stance. This is my process. This is our way through it. This is what we're devoted to do it. And I'm persistent in my approach to a place of deep attending, that exquisite listening, that deep attending to all that wants to emerge right in front of me. Last week, I wrote an article that's been circulating pretty widely on overwhelm as being the state in which we get all caught up in problem solving and seeing ourselves as failures when we can't fix all the problems. Attending is that deep state where we're able to take a deep breath and step back and say, there is something in this mess. There is something in this tangled mess of problems that have landed in my lap that I need to attend to. I don't need to fix it all. I need to attend to it because it's trying to teach me something. It's data for me. How can I stay in that place and not be captured by the anxiety so that I can attend to what is wanting to emerge here in this time and place? And then finally, the final shift is from striving to surrender. And I'm not using surrender here in the sense of giving up, waving the white flag and saying, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to sit here and not do any leadership, anything, because nothing can change this moment. Surrender is the stance of yielding, of deep yielding, to say, this is the reality of the situation I find myself in, this overwhelmed capacity that I find myself in. I have to surrender to it. I have to quit trying to master it and recognize that this deep disorientation we find ourselves in is here for a reason. It's here because some of this stuff is breaking because it has to break so that the new thing can emerge. And if I'm so wrapped up in my striving to overcome everything that's breaking, I'm going to miss the moment for opportunity and creativity. So I need to surrender. Now, when I talk about this concept, one of the questions I often get from leaders is, isn't this just going to make me look really weak as a leader? And I especially hear this from female leaders and leaders of color who feel like they've had to work so hard to garner whatever little bit of authority the organization will give them. And now I'm saying, stand there in a place of unknowing and surrender. What? They're going to overthrow me. And the reality is, a lot of people will think that you're being weak. It will look to people, to some people, like you're not doing enough, that you're not working hard enough to overcome it all. But eventually, if you can stand in a place with people in your mutual not knowing and say, yes, we're anxious, but it's okay because we're standing here together. And we've got enough, we've got enough to not only survive this season, but to thrive in this season, and to communicate a level of confidence about that while you stand there, not pretending that you have all the answers. I will just say, for me, this was a frightening thing to do as I first became aware that these were spiritual shifts I needed to make, because as a consultant, you show up in places to know things, right? Nobody's going to pay to fly you across the country to have you show up and say, I don't know, what do you think, right? But in fact, I found that the more I indicated to people my lack of certainty about things, the more authentic they received that, and the more eager they were to work with me in this season of confusion. And I think that's true for leaders too, that if you can stand in the unknowing, if you can surrender to the questions themselves, if you can stand in awe of what's wanting to emerge next, that remarkable things can happen in this space if you will make these spiritual shifts. Okay, I've been talking at you for a long time. I'm gonna stop my screen share, and I'm going to invite Sarah Drummond in with me to begin our Q&A portion. And also, while we're doing this, I'm going to go ahead and share in the chat a link to that article on overwhelm I referred to, so that if you haven't seen that yet, that you'll have an opportunity to do that, to read that. There it is. Sarah, are you there? There she is.
Susan, you walk on the ground I worship. I absolutely love reading your work, but being with you in conversation is just magical. Thank you so much for being present to all of us today. I can see across the screen a number of Andover Newton alums who are here. If you're an Andover Newton alum, I'd be so grateful if you just could go to your reactions button and just give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up, because I would love to just acknowledge the presence of alums from the school I serve. So great to be here with you today, Susan. And I would like to kick off our questions with one that's actually on my heart today, that came up for me really early in your presentation. So yes, it's a liminal time. Anxieties can be overwhelming. Many of our institutions were already very distressed when a series of crises came up over the transom at the same time. And sometimes implosion is good. And yet, in my observation, the people who find themselves at the find themselves in the position of being the proverbial last straw are often pretty vulnerable people. So, for example, you talked about gender identity as this faith community that's been through the ringer, was able to kind of keep it together until there were questions and challenges to the way gender language was being used. And that was what led to the implosion. I feel like leaders have a responsibility to shepherd implosions, but they also have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable in their communities. And I just wonder, where do you see the role of the leader in protecting those who some might call scapegoats, who are basically becoming the symptom bearers of all the anxiety when they really can't afford it?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, Sarah. I like the way that you phrased that. I think that, primary work for the leader in these seasons, right, is to kind of create a container for this adaptive work and to measure where the anxiety level is. But a primary way that we do our work in liminal seasons is by shaping the narrative that's forming. And what I hear you talking about is the mistaken way in which narratives are forming now around, our denomination is splitting over gender identity, which then makes these vulnerable people the cause of all our angst, when in fact many of our institutions are failing because they've been on that trajectory for a long time, right? And so how do we talk about, I think one of the most important things we do in liminal seasons is we help people make meaning and find purpose, right? And I think that there are ways we can do that work while also protecting the most vulnerable among us. I think that when we stop and we say, my only job is to protect the vulnerable, we get a little misplaced in that because we lose sight of missionally what we're trying to accomplish. But I think maintaining our focus on the mission by saying, here's where we've come from, here's the moment we find ourselves in, and all of the complexity of what has brought us here. So to thicken that narrative up, so it's not a narrative about that vulnerable group, but it's a narrative about all of the ways in which we've been liminal. And then to help people find a purpose now. And that's true for when we work and we create health in our organizations by doing those kinds of things. The way I talk about this is we want our organizations to be blobby. We want them to have all kinds of cushy edges so that the vulnerable fit inside our organizations, right? It's when we become polarized and we create these really thin narratives that we kind of eliminate the blobbiness of the organization. We become these polarized things, and the vulnerable become scapegoats and they become driven from the organization. And so all that to say, I think one of the best ways for us to protect the vulnerable is to do really good organizational leadership. that's clear about what's happening in the moment. Does that address what you were talking about, Sarah?
Oh, it's a really helpful framing, Susan. Let's move into another question. You used the expression when we were talking about moving into unknowing, as you're not suggesting that we all just became suddenly stupid.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, in March 2020, became suddenly stupid. And I think a lot of people on this call have stories they can relate to where we just didn't have the skill sets, be those in technology, be those in difficult conversations about race and policing and injustice, be they about HVAC and whether a space is safe or not safe because of technology that we know nothing about. So I just wonder, when we talk about unknowing and sudden stupidity, sudden onset stupidity, in what ways can unknowing transcend those technical bodies of knowledge? And when is it okay for us to draw alongside those who genuinely don't know the basics of what needs to happen?
Yeah. Well, and I would say, Sarah, you didn't actually become stupid. You just, none of us did. We all felt like we did, right? We all felt very ill-equipped for the moment, and we realized that there were other bodies of knowledge that we didn't have access to that we needed, right? Suddenly we saw staff teams and congregations transform where the tech people and the communications people became the gods of staff teams, right, for a year, because we needed those skill sets. So unknowing, it really isn't about a stupidity. You still had all the knowledge you needed to be able to lead, is my point, right? But we're grabbed out of that place of relying falsely on an acquired body of knowledge that we have accumulated. That still is going to serve us in this next chapter, but we're going to have to make space for a lot of not knowing to figure out what else has to emerge here. And I just find over and over, I was in the same situation with everyone else. People were coming to me like, you wrote the book about this season. What do we do next? And I was like, I don't know. I just wrote a book, right? That's all I did. There is a quality of leadership presence that allows you to stand in that unknowing space with people and project confidence, right? Right? There's a new body of knowledge that we're going to need that we don't have. There are answers that are going to need to be discovered that nobody knows yet. But we can discover that. We can find the people who know, because the organization is still about what the organization has been about. And people actually admire and respect that in a leader because it's authentic, it's vulnerable, and it's real, and you're not abandoning them. You're still communicating that you care and that you're invested. All of that's received well.
In both these answers, what I'm hearing you say is that there's a revisitation of our purpose, revisitation of the mission at the heart of letting people down easy that we don't have all the answers, at the heart of protecting those who would be scapegoated if we allowed them to think that this tangential issue is the central issue. The next question.
Can I say one more thing about that?
Please, Susan.
Sarah. Yes, rediscovery of purpose, but one of the ways, misplaced ways, that I'm seeing leaders lean into right now is wanting to take time to rewrite mission statements. Not a good season for doing that. Yes, we have to lean into purpose. Yes, there is a body of planning work to be done now, but it's not traditionally what we have done, the kind of linear planning that most of us have been used to, and coming up with a big new strategic plan. Probably not the right work for this season. You know, there's a different body of work around asking driving questions that we don't know the answer to these questions, but if we did, they would make a big difference. Mm-hmm. And then planning for experiments to learn more about those driving questions. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of planning work that can go into that, but not traditional. All right, we need to revisit our mission statement. Nobody's got the energy for that, and it will suck the life out of you and your people taking the time to do that. So,
well, Susan, you unwittingly pointed us toward the next question. One of our participants is asking questions about backsliding. about backsliding. And as Susan knows, many and some of on the call know, I use your book in a class on ministerial leadership. And one of the themes that we lift up is that the leader has to prevent the community from resolving its anxiety by rushing out
Yes.
Rushing out of the liminality, just making up some new thing to go to so as to resolve their own anxiety. And they need to prevent the community from backsliding into what feels comfortable. It's as though people will do almost anything to not feel the discomfort of liminality. Yes. And we need to make it as comfortable as possible, because they're going to have to be there a while for emergence to work. So backsliding is the topic, however, that's come up from two different participants. And I wonder if you could say some words about how do we not pine away for back when everything was perfect, the quote unquote good old days.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to revisit, what I talked about is one of the primary bodies of work that a leader does in a season like this one is tending to our narrative that's emerging, but also tending to the old narrative, right? This is a perfect season to let people tell those stories that make them feel good, but then begin to excavate those stories for better values is the way that I would, talk about that. We have a tendency to talk about the good old days and create these really thin narratives that eliminate all the complexity of the time and the fact that there was, in most glory era stories, the seeds are planted for the decline that came after it, right? And we don't talk about that part of the story, right? So thicken those stories up. When they pine for the good old days, let them tell those stories, and then start asking provocative questions about those stories and saying, so why didn't the good old days last? What happened? And to just ask people, is there anybody else who has a different version of that story? If it's in the live memory of people in the room, there's lots of ways to get at the fact that people, when they tell stories and they tell them over and over, they create these fictional accounts that don't really represent the truth back then. And being truthful about back then helps us be truthful about now. I would also say, to help with backsliding, the other thing is, as leaders, we have to be able to read the room. We have to be able to read the anxiety level and to know when it's just getting too hot in here, when people are just too disoriented and anxious to do anything helpfully adaptive. And when we sense as leaders that that's happening, sometimes we will calm the system down, calm the room down, by actually taking them into some of their favorite stories, into some of their, let's talk about how we got to this moment and how we survived that time back there. So there's ways to use that to your advantage without letting it devolve into full-on backsliding, to let people go there for a little bit, to calm down, to regenerate their resources. Why are we talking about this beloved old time? It's, it's okay if we're talking about it because we're rediscovering the resilience of who we were then. And now let's bring that into the present time. But when it turns into, I just want to go back to a simpler time because I don't want to face any of this, that's not particularly helpful.
Susan, I think we have time for just one more question, and then a request from one on the call who is eager to hear a prayer. And I thought maybe a prayer would be a good way to end, which is the hope for prayer for the community in the in-between time. But a final question for now, there are several people on this in this conference that are lay leaders in congregations.
Okay.
They're not the ordained. They're not the ordained leader. And they are. One has posed a question about the role of the lay leadership, the non-CEO, in sustaining a time of discernment amidst liminality.
Yeah, we toss around the word leader all the time as if it's only an authorized word that gets to be used. Like you're only a leader if you've been authorized by the institution to do so. Somebody has laid hands on you and given you a title and a role. But in fact, that's actually not how I use the language at all. When I use the word leader, I mean someone who has the impulse to make a meaningful difference in the moment. And liminal seasons are prime seasons for lay leaders to do really productive work. So in the book, I talk about 4 distinct bodies of work, right, that are helpful to a season like this one. And we didn't really have time to talk about them today, but tending to institutional memory, deepening group discernment, rediscovering purpose or clarifying a purpose now, and also engaging the emergence as it happens. And none of those bodies of work require that you have been put in charge of something. They're all bodies of work that you can do from whatever part of the organization you find yourself in, because it's simply an invitation for people to stand with you and to do that work together. And it doesn't require board approval.
Susan, could you offer up a prayer for?
I would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gracious and Holy One, we find ourselves in this most confusing of seasons, where in our disorientation, we are apt to believe that we are failing. We are apt to believe that we have lost your approval, that you no longer care about what happens to your church. And yet we sense glimmers of movement, reassurance that remind us always that we stand in the palm of your hand, reminding us that people of future generations will look back at us and tell the story of how we led through this most challenging of times, and the incredible ways in which we, like Moses, delivered a people out of bondage through a long, very confusing state, and at some future point, watch them move into a promised land. Strengthen us that we might find the resilience to be those leaders, to stand in confidence with you, always resting in your assurance. Amen.